And with that, it is my honor to introduce you Alan Kay for our keynote.
Okay, this is just a little preliminary warning here. Because the internet has done in supported criticism. It's like Gresham's law. Bad money drives out the good, and there's so much unsupported criticism that good criticism, criticism that's supported, is often claimed to be a rant. But this is not a rant. However, it will be critical. So my first exhibit here is a kind of American dream. So it is the trappings of riding the bicycle. It's very fancy. It has training wheels. The buyer of this device would be a parent, probably. And most important thing about it is it's like frets on a violin. It happens that training wheels actually don't help you to learn to ride a bike. In fact, they help you towards the opposite. The number one skill you have to learn when you're riding a bike is to balance and turn into the turns, and the training wheels prevent you from doing that. And so this is not a joke. Just when I was looking for slides for this on the internet, I found amazingly that there are a number of adult societies that have bikes with training wheels like this. This is not a joke. These people do touring, they race, everything else, because this is what they learned. Now, of course, many children get off the training wheels at some point, but significant numbers of adults don't. Now, the way to ride a bike, and this is relatively recent compared to the training wheel phenomenon, is what you want is to get the kids low bikes. They don't even have any pedals because that's not the germane part of it. You want low bikes so they don't fall over and it's kind of like a scooter. And what you do is you learn to glide and to turn into the thing. That's how you learn to ride a bike. So these two exhibits are very germane, I think, to what we're talking about today. So I think of this side as marketing. Marketing is basically dealing with what people want. And that is a large number, like we want sugar, we want fat, we want fantasy football. We have many, many wants. And if you're interested in it, you might look at a book called Human Universals by Donald Brown, who's an anthropologist who's identified about 300 things, genetic things, that we are born wanting. And many of the consumer society successes today are technological amplifiers for those things. Now, the other group of people that are interested in who people are, we heard about we should be interested in who the user is going to be, are educators. They also study. This is what we're supposed to be doing here. I want to try and differentiate between the two. And educators are interested in what people need. So this requires taking a moral stance. And it's tricky because, of course, we are all flawed beings also, and people who take moral stance who are flawed beings often wind up with something that resembles a religion or a cult. But still, what the educators are interested in doing is essentially changing rather than catering. And in many cases, people don't want what they need. In fact, there's a whole field called behavioral economics. Came after anthropology got politicized. We fortunately have this branch of cognitive psychology called behavioral economics that has been looking at what people do, not what they say, people as they are rather than as they're supposed to be. And so the interesting question, it would be really nice if we could get people to want what they need. And there are some actual ways of doing that. And I'll mention a couple. So this is I could not find a picture of this proper British lady I had supper with 30 years now in London. But Mary Poppins, she was a Mary Poppins type. And we had a great conversation. It drifted into education. And at some point, she said, "Oh, you Americans have the best high school education in the world." And I said, "What?" And she said, "What a pity you have to go to college to get it." Now, graduate school. So there are these tests of reading, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. They have a dismal standard for what they call proficient reading. It's not what we would call proficient, but it's the main one that is looked at. And it's mainly for K through 12. But what's cool, if you dig around on their website, you can find that they've also looked at using the same criteria at graduates of four-year colleges and universities. And in 1992, 42% of college graduates were proficient or better. So less than half. In 2003, 11 years later when they did it, it was down to 31%. So colleges are not even guarding the literacy. So what this says to me that on this average, I mean, this is one number for 4,000 institutions, but what it says is that lumped together, colleges are essentially selling degrees. We kind of know that, but that's what it means, because the college is not actually guarding what it means to be educated, that in some very important senses, they are giving people degrees who cannot possibly be educated. So another little preliminary idea here is, because we tend to use Indo-European languages, including the ones came out of India, those languages are very noun-oriented. Nouns are mostly about things. The things don't interpenetrate. And so if we think of ideas as matter, they oppose each other, but we also could think of ideas as being made out of radiation. We get superposition. Now we can shine as many lights on the same spot as we want, and we don't have to resolve them. We can look at the mixtures of them, and we can consider them separately. We don't have to make a decision. They're all occupying the same space. And I'm offering this up as a metaphor because even before design thinking was a phrase, the number one thing about design is being able to hold mutually incompatible things in your head for a very, very long time before you make any commitments. We tend to commit early, much too early. So things are processes, nouns are verbs. Here's the t-shirt for today. This is Silicon Valley, so this would have been, we always make t-shirts. So my design t-shirt would show the superposition of ideas as radiation. And can't do a talk without a Winston Churchill story. There are so many good ones. And I'll avoid my tendency to digress to tell you 5 of them. But the one that's good, this one, he was at a party. There he is smoking his cigar. And the hostess, who is a duchess, came over to him and said, "Mr. Churchill, I'm so distressed. I just saw Earl so-and-so over there steal one of my silver salt shakers." And Churchill thought for a while, and he went over to the Earl, and on the way, he picked up another salt shaker and put it in his pocket. And when he got over to the Earl, he took it out, and he said, "I think we've been noticed. Perhaps we should put these back." So this is how, if you want to get something done, the way you do it is not so much trying to convince somebody, but to create a tribe. That is a conspiracy, because anthropologically, that is what we are more than any other thing. We are tribal beings, and we tend to automatically oppose things outside of our tribe, even if they're good ideas, because that isn't the way we think. In fact, we don't think. We're not primarily thinking animals. So this thing about coding is often mentioned side by side with jobs, competitiveness, diversity. It's got a million things going on with it. But I thought I'd put up 3 other things that I think need to be thought about first. And one of them is I think our primary duty as adults is not to go out and get a job, but to think about the next generation. That's part of the larger picture of thing. A job is just about us and now. Children are the next generation. And Marshall McLuhan said, children are the messages we send to the future. But my retort to McLuhan was, no, they are the future we're sending to the future. They're not a message. They are the future. And we've got another duty in a society that has created so much wealth via a certain complicated, difficult kind of cooperation. The reason we're all here is not because we're competitive. The reason we're here is because we live in a larger structure in which competition, the hunting and gathering parts of us that go back a couple of 100,000 years, are subsumed under a larger set of cooperation that creates all of the wealth. Hunting and gatherers need fertile valleys created by somebody else, nature. They strip it dry, that's the impulse, and move on. Sounds a little bit like business. Doesn't even sound agricultural. But in order to scale our natural tendencies to exploit, we have to have something very, very different. And we are the beneficiaries of that. So if we're thinking about education, my goodness, don't even bother with this for a while. Let's worry about what's really going on. And then there's this idea which is almost never talked about in a pragmatic society like ours, which is I've just been calling richness. It can happen in the context of work, it can happen with children, it can happen with citizenship, but it's basically something that is the man does not live by bread alone idea. And I believe that this is a rallying point to try and understand what the rest of education is about, particularly as it relates to how we should think about children in the next generation. Okay, so that was one. I'm basically doing 5 points here before I look at them a little more deeply. I usually don't do that. I don't like top-down stuff, but I figured for this talk it would be good. So the first thing had to do with, what are some of the contexts that we care about. Second context is Humans 101. So one part of it is, of course, we're very complex, but our minds are very theatrical. The way we respond to theater is also the way we respond to what we like to call reality, which in itself is a kind of theater. And there are a few people here there's some neuro people here, right? I saw, anybody? Yes. So tell them all about it this afternoon. So these are, understanding more about what's going on here is really important. So the theatrical thing. Another one is our minds are tiny. Here's George Miller, one of the inventors of cognitive psychology. And in fact, 7 ± 2 has been downgraded 7 plus or minus 2 was dealing with number sequences and stuff, and this has been looked at in a lot. And the truth is that we're terrible at multitasking. And in fact, it is very difficult for us to sensibly deal with multiple things, even if they have been chunked hugely. So we can think of this as, like if you take these two ideas together, this is also user interface design 101. We have theatrical reactions to things. We need to create theater when we're creating a user interface design, and we're completely limited. And so playing those off against each other is tremendously important. We'll look at this a little bit more. And then a more controversial idea is that we are mostly not human. This is something that is outside of the myth that human beings like to believe in. But in fact, a lot of us is primate and a whole lot of us is mammalian. And how that plays out against some of the more recent additions to our mental apparatus, particularly our culture, are interesting. So these three things are things that are worthwhile holding in mind. By the way, these are things that computer people just hate to think about. Most computer people went into computing because they were disturbed by other human beings. And one of the reasons that coding, programming has stayed so much the way it is, terrible set of ideas that were almost necessary in the 40s and 50s, are still around today as the primary ways of doing programming, because they are the most mechanical ways that in the small they are the most understandable, the most reliable. The problem is in the large, they don't scale at all. In the large, they are the least reliable way of doing anything. And it's only by looking at tiny little places that people have any comfort at all. And so they stay with where they're comfortable. So the theatrical part of us is lots bigger than we think. The limitations are are smaller than we think. And the relationship we have with our heritage is we are much more different than we think we are. Okay, now the third idea here, we go back to the first Turing Award winner. So this little gnome of a man was one of the great men of our time, Al Perlis. And he more or less created computer science. And I thought, since the CS term is bandied about a lot, it might be interesting to see what the guy who invented the term actually meant by it. So he said this in the early 60s, and somebody said, what does that mean? And he said, computer science is the science of processes. I remember science, he didn't mean science as in library science. He didn't mean science as in social science. He actually meant science. He didn't mean it as a metaphor. He meant we need to have a science of things in process. And there are a gazillion of them. That is what he meant. He didn't have an engineering definition. That's something else. He said we need to understand things in process. And he meant all processes. He meant mechanical processes, technological processes. There's the Constitution, social processes. The guys who did the Constitution were social geniuses. They actually put together a system better than any computer system we've ever done, because it has millions and millions of not terribly cooperating parts, and it has basically thrived with some hiccups along the way for hundreds of years. Think about that. And the Constitution, I have a version of it with me, is just a tiny little book. It's a meta recipe for a very complicated multiprocessing operating system, far, far beyond anything we've been able to do. And of course, biology, and of course, mental processes. All of these processes were things. And the other thing that Perlis said is, besides looking at all processes, it itself, because of what it is, can serve as a representation, a kind of a mathematics for all processes. So this is a big idea. This is an exciting idea. It excited me. It's like one of the greatest things. I hate to see computing and computer science watered down to some terrible kind of engineering that the Babylonians might have failed at, with tiny conceptions of programming a computer like munging variables with an assignment statement. That is pathetic. And I'm saying it in this strong way because you need to realize that we're in the middle of a complete form of bullshit that has grown up out of the pop culture colliding with this power and wealth. In order to serve education, which I think is much more still should be about what people need rather than what they want, education can't cave in to what the pop culture does. It has to think about itself as being about the other culture, the developed culture. Shouldn't get rid of the pop culture. The pop culture has incredible energy. Any developed culture needs that energy, but it cannot give in to that energy. There has to be a reasonable tension there. So that was number 3. Number 4 is, boy, if you look at other fields, like mechanical CAD or electrical CAD or BioCAD now, they have all these great toys. They happen to be all implemented on computers. Computer-aided design, simulators, and now fab. You think it up, say, mechanically, whatever it is, design it, simulate it, now we can build it. Build a flute. So the idea here is, in every place except computing, is this notion of people moving towards wanting to design and wanting to ship the design. It's in computing that we are so far behind. We're still, more than 80% of the undergraduates at UCLA, a top 10 computer science department, use bi-terminal emulators, which itself was emulating decks of punched cards, doing the same kind of compilation, loading and linking in, say, C++, that's their main language, there as was done 50 years ago. This does not scale, and yet this is what computer people are doing. They don't have anything like what more sensible people in these other fields are using computers for. So if you take these two things together, take Perlis and this notion is a programming system, yeah, part of it is the functionality part. That's what you see in most systems for let's everybody code. It's got a, most of them got numbers, maybe they got arrays, they got assignment statements, all the usual suspects there. That's not even close. That is not what to put in front of people. What you need is an environment. An environment is, it's about systems, it's about design, it's about media. Programming language is a user interface as much as it is any other thing. Why have multiple ones? They're all Turing equivalent. So what's the difference? Well, at one end, some of them run faster than others. At another part, you might have to write more or less code. But another part is they should be something that you think in terms of. And there, the idea of a user interface and giving you ways of thinking about things starts dominating. Okay, last of the 5 ideas to get started here is this notion of thresholds. This is critical. I think this is an interesting thing that in science and engineering, this is something that is understood in a way, but is rarely talked about. And in most educational situations, it's not understood and thus rarely talked about. And it's this idea. Time, progress, wiggly line. See them in the paper all the time. Could be reading scores. Yay, boo. Yay, boo. Yay. It's meaningless. Absolutely and completely meaningless. Same with the stock market. No matter what happens in the stock market, there's some rationalization for it, even if it's just looking at random noise. Think about what thinking is. Thinking is not being logical. Thinking is choosing the environment that you're going to think in before you start rationalizing. So let's put a threshold in. So my threshold name is what is actually needed. And here we can see that this guy and this guy are irrelevant. This guy is really relevant. We got past the threshold. Now we're really doing something. Before we were just bullshitting around. Yay, we don't care. The fluctuations here are things that we're really interested in because we're guiding this growth process. Now, for most things in human society, we've got this. The threshold is up here, and now none of this actually means anything. This is like reading. Take reading. It doesn't matter where it's going up or down because it's all below threshold. The children aren't really learning to read fluently enough, and so you're always getting a qualitative gap. You're basically in this zone I call the pink zone. Doesn't matter. Most people don't care about it, and the idea of thresholds are actually fought because a threshold will reveal something is actually wrong. Now, reforms or impulses often happen down here. Here's one. Huge amount of effort, fizzle, yay, bonk. Completely irrelevant. And it can be in any area. It could be in education. You see it all the time. How about the moonshot? Hey, we made it to the moon. So what? We set back space travel more than 50 years. Why? Because the physics, the chemistry, and the mathematics of space travel are that it just doesn't work with chemical rocketry. It's about mv equals mv. You're exchanging momentum. Chemical processes cannot get the velocity of the particles you're letting out to be high enough to actually give you. That's why the Saturn rocket is 45 stories, literally. Have you ever seen one up close? Cape Canaveral Museum in Florida. Don't miss it. They have one sideways. So this is a 45-story building hung sideways. That is 1.5 football fields. And it is all high explosive except for the little end part where there are 3 people. If you want a visual explanation of the physics of chemical rocketry, no, you cannot do space travel that way. And this whole thing was a huge effort, but it was aimed at the wrong place. So you actually set up a bunch of technologies that now had to be exploited further, and you still don't get anywhere, and you still don't get anywhere. And now everybody's lost their taste for it. The web. I will not go into my diatribe about the web, but the web browser, everybody uses it every day. It's like one of the worst ideas ever. Ever. It only does a few things compared to what it should be doing. And this is hard to explain to people. It's hard to find people who actually are willing to criticize the web. But when I say, well, gee, you can't even, it was done on a machine that already had WYSIWYG editing. After 20 years, why doesn't it have WYSIWYG editing? Well, they're getting to it. It only took a couple of years to do WYSIWYG editing in the first place. So what we've got there is the ultimate Esau's cup of soup, if you know that story from the Bible. Esau came home from a hunt. He was the big, hairy He-Man brother. The little brother, Jacob, was cooking some soup, and Esau said, "Brother, I'm hungry. Can I have some soup?" And Jacob said, "Yes, for your birthright." And Esau said, "Okay." That's humans 101. That is what behavioral economics is all about. We are willing to sell a lot for momentary convenience. So here are 2 words, better and perfect, that we need to really pay heed. This is the more dangerous one. Better and perfect are the 2 enemies of what is actually needed. Right? Perfect, as I was talking to Mike earlier. I hope to get to this slide because he did something that is really cool. I'm going to show you the abstraction of it, and I hope we get to what it actually is. No, better, disaster. This is where incremental progress comes from. We need qualitative progress. So you need to get there. It's the lowest thing that is above the threshold. This is the secret. See, now, this is something that I don't teach you in design school. But it's something that's really important to understand if you want to invent something that is going to generate, say, 30 trillion bucks, like 24 of us at Xerox PARC. This is how you do it. You have to find this thing, and I call this the MacCready sweet spot. Paul MacCready was the guy who did man-powered flight after 50 years of really good people failing at it. He did it in 6 months from the time he decided to do it. I will not use the time to tell that story, but maybe in the question and answer, because it's a great story. But this guy, more than any other person I ever knew, and he wouldn't budge until he found this. So you can think of this as the primary part of making progress is problem finding. Problem finding. Forget about problem solving. You're probably in the wrong context. You're already in a place where your sense of problems is probably completely wrong. So like the premise of this whole meeting is probably completely wrong. Start there. Probably completely, but it's good because you got the people here. But just start off with the idea it's probably completely wrong. What is actually needed and what is that? And here's something the funders hate. Like if this is Xerox PARC, this was the ARPA community for 10 years. Xerox PARC is held up as some miraculous oasis in the desert. It wasn't true at all. We were just an outgrowth of this much larger community that in fact thought up most of the ideas, the philosophies, and we were just recent PhDs. I was the oldest person there. I was 30. Butler Lamson was 27. The guy who set it up, Bob Taylor, was 38. And there was all this money that went into inventing computer graphics and artificial intelligence and the programming language Lisp and just every kind of thing there. And when we went to PARC, what we looked at is what is this for this ARPA dream? And once you get there, you get a whole region now you can operate in, because it's not just getting to a point, you're actually getting to a place with a different set of ideas. And all of a sudden, you're definitely above what is actually needed, and for a while, you can actually make real progress, not fake progress. And basically, you can think of it as taking our normal pink brains and adding a point of view, an epistemological stance, a way of looking at things that was different, that makes our weak mental operations much, much more powerful. I mean, my slogan for that is, point of view is worth 80 IQ points. It's the number one thing that you want to do because we're terrible at thinking in weak contexts. Okay, don't forget that when you're thinking about things this afternoon. And we probably don't have any funders in the room, but I like to point out to them that no invention has been more practical than science. I also say this to business. Business is always saying, well, we're in business to make money. I said, no, you aren't really. You're only trying to make millions and billions. Science has created trillions and trillions of dollars off almost no investment. Get your head on straight, invest the right way. Okay, so let's quickly take a look at a couple of these closer. We take a look at these. Any questions so far on this? See, I claim this is not a rant because I'm happy to justify anything that I've said, but because this is an oral talk, I'm short-circuiting and just making it as claims. But I'm sure you'll trust what I'm saying here. So take these 4 areas. Let's take a look at jobs. Coding for jobs. So I got my friend Vishal here, and I happen to know him very well, I think. We've known each other for years, right? Yeah. So I'm going to put something into his mouth, and let's see what he says. Vishal, my screen Vishal says, I don't want my folks code the old bad ways. I want them to know how to design and think. Is that reasonable?
Absolutely.
100%, right? CEO of a company that has 180,000 people, and it depends on programming. The problem is teaching people to code in the way most of this is being done. It's not going to get you there. It's just dicking around underneath the threshold. So if we're even going to worry about jobs for 3 nanoseconds, we need something qualitatively different. Let's take a look at next generation. There's so many things we could say here, but one is we have decided in our society we're going to teach reading and writing to every child regardless of whether they want to or not, right? It is not their choice. So this violates Einstein, who said love is a better teacher than duty. I happen to agree with this idea because I think it's the duty of society to do something about instilling the strongest parts of the culture in the next generation. And so we're just taking that, even though in many ways it's going to be problematic. Thoreau said, without books, history is silent, literature dumb, science crippled, thought and speculation at a standstill. So we're just doing it. High school is way too late. I don't even know why you're bothering with it here. Period. This stuff, I mean, it's okay if you got spare time. But if you're going to take a subject seriously, like reading and writing, like thinking, and whatever the part that computing might have to play in thinking in the future, and I think it's a big part, going to take it serious. Forget about high school. We're talking about something that has to begin early. And this has been a tough sell because the way America looks at it, we have jobs problems, and if we train them, we can get... No. That's disaster. That's like quarter-to-quarter thinking done on a national scale. It is just bad. So we have to think earlier. Now, if you have good thoughts for children, an interesting thing is that those are not bad for tossing into high school as long as you don't take them too seriously. Like the user interface that everybody uses today, the GUI, that was my invention. And I originally designed it for children. And I designed it that way because we had far more important things that we wanted them to learn. That user interface is not a good user interface for adults. But in fact, it's the one that adults wound up using because we made it easier for children to learn. Same thing, the iPad. The iPad is good for 2-year-olds and 92-year-olds and nobody in between. It's a terrible user interface and hardly anybody knows it. Think about it. And Apple finally realized, maybe we should put some tools in there, like maybe a pencil, maybe a keyboard. Reminds me of an idea from the 60s. They'll get there eventually. Okay, so the relationship here with what Vishal wants, we have to take a bit of a long view. It's not, K through 12 is 13 years. How long does it take to even get going? How long does it take to deploy? That's what we have to be thinking about. 5 years from now, today's kindergartners will be in 5th grade, and we know a lot about what to do with 5th graders, and we know a bit about what to do with younger children. The logistics are enormous. for doing any kind of deployment. We'll talk about that in a bit. Biggest barrier for children? All the adults around them. This happens to be it's a parliament in a country we regard as eminently civilized. On this particular day, they lost it, and it wasn't the only time. But that's just a symptom. The problem is because adults are trying to recapitulate the children into themselves. If they aren't at the tippy top of the century that they're living in, they're recapitulating children into the past. This is something Montessori pointed out in her first book. She said, the biggest problem, she said, children are driven by nature to learn the environment around them. They don't know where they're being born into. By the way, she was one of the top 3 people in anthropology in Italy. I have this urge to digress, and this is a good story. So Montessori's undergraduate degree was in engineering. That's what she wanted to get a PhD in. They wouldn't let her. This is the 19th century in Italy. And so she put up a fuss. And finally, the University of Rome said they'd admit her for a medical degree if she could pass this test. They were sure she couldn't pass. But the thing about Maria Montessori, she was just much, much smarter than any of us in this room. She was a first-class intellect. She aced this test and became the first woman physician in Italy. And not having had a calling for it, she decided to do slum medicine. And it was through the slum medicine that she saw the children and she started thinking up ideas for them. Meanwhile, she was studying anthropology. And the number one principle she had is children don't know what society they're being born into, and yet they learn it. Therefore, we need to set up the society we want them to acclimate to. And if we can't do it in the home, then we should make the school embody the idea. It's not a question of telling the children about the century they're living in. It's a question of putting them in the century that they're living in. This is an idea that Seymour Papert used very strongly in his metaphor for math land. You want to go learn French, go to France. Want to go learn math, go to a math land. Except we don't have a math land. Make one. So this is a big idea, and I think this is the number one thing that should be thought about if we're doing design this afternoon, is this idea of, hey, what if children were brought up in the future? There are some interesting efforts. There was an extended Montessori effort done by the British between the 2 world wars called the British Infant School System. Anybody here ever hear of that? Yeah. So basically the reasoning there was we created the stewards of the British Empire in the boarding schools, Eton and Harrow. We took the children away from, this is Plato's Republic 101, right? Take the children away from their parents, train them, make them into the kind of Brits, the official Brit. That's the job of Eton and Harrow. We'll create all these administrators. And the reformers in the 20s said, yeah, that's a really good idea. We can't build such schools for the working class, but what we can do is take the children away from their parents for all of their waking hours. This is the British infant school system. They fed them. Children were in these schools for about 12 hours a day. And what they did was to extend Montessori's ideas in some very powerful ways. So if you're interested in this way of, see, everybody gets that this is one of the ways you get people to want what they need, right? Because we don't think about whether we want to learn our culture. We just learn it. Nobody tells it. We're in this thing. It's seamless. Steve Jobs. This is his big brother photograph from 1984. Everybody should learn how to code. It teaches you how to think. well, teaches you how to think badly. This is, I mean, Steve didn't even code. So he had no idea what he was talking. This is just complete bullshit. And just empirically, if you look at, or maybe it's just anecdotally, but it'd be great to do, just look at the last 300 computer people you looked at and maybe encountered on the internet or something. And there's no evidence that they can think at all. They can do a few little things, but in fact, they don't even know what thinking is. Because thinking is not actually logic. That was the mistake that the Greeks made, and that was the mistake that St. Thomas Aquinas made. It was the major mistake of Middle Ages. It was also the major mistake of postmodernism. That isn't what it is. So we should learn programming, but it's for different, bigger, more important reasons. But don't be led astray just because this guy was successful in the pop culture. I knew him very well. Steve and I were friends to the extent that he could have a friend. I was the guy who set up the Pixar deal for him, besides having a fair amount to do with the Mac. So I knew him very well. And he's one of the great salesmen of all time. Okay, so citizenship. So the simple one here, I think, is just Jefferson's. Basically, the ultimate powers reside in the people, and if we think them not enlightened enough, let's not take it away from them, but to better inform their discretion through education, period. That is why public education is set up in this country. I'm not going to belabor this point, but you could hardly find that this is the fact when you go to any school. They teach dates here and there, but I've never found a public school that actually teaches the children how the country works. What was the whole point of setting it up that particular way, and why has it worked as well as it has? So the question here is we have to ask, what does enlightened enough mean for this century? What does that mean? I'm just pointing this out because if we don't take care of things like this, it's moot whether children learn how to program, regardless of whether we have perfect participation by every ethnic group and every gender and every. It's moot. We have to take care of the larger ideas in education. Okay, so richness. So this is a diagram I like, that we have the systems of the natural world, we have the social systems, we have technological systems, and we have ourselves as many systems. And richness for most people comes out of different aspects of this. We could also turn it around and say, hey, if we're going to do an education for the 21st century, it is precisely this that we should look at. And by the way, there's an underlying unifying way of thinking about things, and that is as terms of systems. These things are abstractly similar as systems, even though they ramify in many different ways. That could be a different way of getting rid of the stovepiping that education is mired in right now. Okay? So we need to deal with the ineffable. And so this whole passel of things is kind of a minimum set I could come up with that would fit into 10 or 15 minutes as part of this talk that needs to be kind of thought about when you're trying to think about something you want every child to learn. And maybe you start with the children, go to richness, come back on citizenship. Maybe you start with richness, go to the children, come over to citizenship. In all cases, jobs winds up being the last thing, because jobs come primarily out of having wealth to do something with. And wealth here, I mean, is the potential. Wealth is like having energy resources. Wealth is like inventing personal computing and the internet. These are the potential for doing things. Those are the things that have to be invented. Okay, so Mr. Spock here is always shocked when anybody pays any attention to human beings, especially technical people. So here's a couple of ideas. Simple metaphor from the 19th century about human memory. It's like an erosion gully. Water comes down in some random place. If it gets a little channel, that channel is a little more efficient. Pretty soon you've got one of these, and then pretty soon you've got the Grand Canyon as an erosion gully. If you've ever been there, it's a hell of a one. And in fact, when you're in here, it's hard to even imagine that you could get out. I suppose you were born in there. You might not even know that this is sort of pinkish. It's the only color there is. So this is a way of thinking about the context that we like to call reality. We're just in an erosion gully. The reason we fight everybody else in the world is they're in a different erosion gully. None of these things are real. They're all made up of stories and beliefs. So here's a thing that's fun. If we had time, we could do a few more of them, but quarters, I like oranges. Hold one so it's twice as far away as the other. And on a retina, as Descartes found out by getting an ox eye and peeling the back off. Isn't that great? The ox was dead. But he was curious as to whether a biological lens worked like a glass one, and it did. So the one that's twice as far away comes out half the size. We can't see it that way because we've got this pachinko machine called the brain. The processes that the brain give rise to, some of them we can call our beliefs, this big pink thing. It's like the Grand Canyon. And we've got a real-time version of it called the waking dream. And as our neuro folks here will say, yeah, the difference between the waking dream and the sleeping dream has a lot to do with just being able to check out references every few seconds, right? Isolation tanks are making a comeback. If you have never tried one, this is a thing from the 60s. You put on a wetsuit, you're in a blood temperature, high saline bath, plugged ears, plugged eyes. You can't feel a thing, you can't hear a thing. About 10 minutes you start going on an LSD trip, except you don't need any LSD. Because the references that are normally used here to keep this waking dream more or less on track are no longer there, and you start generating even while you're awake. Everybody should do this. So what happens with the quarters is we believe that they are the same size, and the combination of that with what we get from our retina, interestingly enough, our retina doesn't win. Our beliefs trump the thing, and the further away guy is about 80% the size, subjectively. This is called size constancy. It's one of many, many illusions that show to the extent that we are disconnected, actually, from what our senses. McLuhan said, until I believe it, I can't see it. That's a good one. And Vishal's favorite is we cannot learn to see until we admit we are blind. That's what happened when we invented science. That was the first time the human race really admitted that its common sense ways of dealing with the world as what it seems were not valid. So you have to do some work to get around this. So here's something that happened right outside my hotel room in May. There was a guy with a hammer, and he had attacked some people the day before further south. This is like 8th Avenue and 43rd Street. And here's what people who saw this attack said. Oh, Mrs. O'Grady said he was in flight when he was shot. He looked like he was trying to get away from the officers. We've heard that recently in other incidents. Ms. Khalsa said, and I'm sorry, maybe I'm crazy, but I saw a man who was handcuffed being shot. So this is seconds after this incident. Now, fortunately, I heard the shots. I was in my hotel room. Fortunately, they had a camera, surveillance camera. So here's what the surveillance camera. Take a look at the upper right-hand corner. There's the guy chasing the female cop. There's the male cop shooting him. Wasn't handcuffed, he wasn't running away. Wasn't doing any of the things the eyewitnesses saw a few seconds ago. They couldn't see what was on their retina. Don't ever get in court. Don't ever go to a jury trial. Don't ever do anything that relies on witnesses. Because the prosecutors have no idea of any of this stuff. They just want to convict. Okay.
As you know, we're here today to honor Mrs. Flexer, who you all know as your first grade teacher. She'll be here in just a minute.
Good morning, everybody. Everything good?
Okay, what's that look? What does that look? Yeah, she's frightened out of her mind. That is the number one. I just got this off the internet. There are zillions of surprise party things that have been caught. So this is a gold mine if you're interested in. People have died. So the internet has captured enough of these. Some people have died of heart attacks from a surprise party. A couple of minutes later, a release in tears. A couple of minutes later, and her report on this says this was the happiest day of her life, despite the fact that she had been almost frightened out of her wits. So Daniel Kahneman would call this first reaction, the fast reaction, system 1. And he called system 1, he said, well, it's not really a system. This is an expository fiction. This is putting together a lot of complicated things into one gloss on fast reactions to things. And the fast reactions are not what we would call thoughtful reactions. They're more like reflexes. Now notice that Mrs. Flexer here knew everything about surprise parties. Why was she surprised? Well, 7 plus or minus 2. She knew about it, but it wasn't in her current context. Her thinking thing, Kahneman system 2, took a while and figured it out. Everything's safe. Now we should ask you, so besides adrenaline, what else happens when you get one of these surprise reactions? What?
So many things.
So many things, like dopamine and serotonin. Why? Well, if you have to fight, you don't want to feel any pain. So what happens is your brain dopes your entire body up so you cannot feel pain when you're in a survival situation. And guess what happens when she didn't have to fight? She was completely alert and coked to the gills on her own dope. You have to understand this stuff. So here's an old book that's still good. It has about 40 different ways of looking at the mind. I put that up there just so you realize that there are dozens of perspectives here. They're not all the last word. Some of them are compatible with each other. Look at these kids. These kids did not get on this roller coaster expecting to die. Nobody does. And yet, and they're presumably very happy at the end. Peekaboo works over and over and over again. And the reason is that system 1 can't be talked out of it. So a test that you do, you go next to a door and you watch me, I'll slam that door and you'll get this. Even though you know every single thing about it, doesn't matter. So it's important to realize that there is a heck of a lot of mechanism in there that deals with real-time reactions to things. And the important thing here is to understand that this fast guy is also dealing with what you might call the atoms of thought for the slow thinking. I'll just let that idea sit for a second. Learning to drive, remember this?
Okay, stop!
Okay, you got your turn signal on? All right, go ahead. Okay, break!
Everybody remember that? You can't, your parent is trying to give you, I can't hear what they're saying. Stop sign's over here, you can barely see what's going. So if you try to drive with system 2, you're going to miss most everything. What happens is you start training these real-time, you get real-time modules that get trained at being able to do all of these things. And you know, for a musical instrument, it might take a couple of years. As McCarthy pointed out, programming is somewhere between learning to drive and flying a plane. So whenever we set up something, it's not always just a cognitive thing. This is one of the problems of some of the approaches we took in the past, is we would tend to say, hey, the drill and practice thing is a bad, well, it is a bad idea. That is not the way to get the repetitions to train system 1. But the thing is, the cognitive approach actually gives you something that is much more like this driving situation, and it's not enough context to do the kinds of thinking that you need. This implies that the pedagogy and the approach is going to be very, very different. That somehow you have to do the atoms of thinking in any thoughtful thing without losing the larger context. So in music, you get it by having the children play really great music, and you're willing to sacrifice everything else in order to get that to happen, but you have to stay on it long, and I used to teach guitar. You have to stay on it long enough so that they actually start developing the system 1 that can handle all the real-time demands. Okay, there are zillions of these. I just went on the internet. I found 20 on the internet, but then I wound up adding some more. These are all biases that have been found, well known. You can think of many of them are aspects of this Grand Canyon idea. Many of them are 7 plus or minus 2. Here's one that wasn't part of this internet thing, but it's something we should look at here. The thing we do all the time is perfect reasoning from wrong premises. Because if we're in the wrong context and we reason brilliantly, we're not going to get anywhere. The Greeks were great at this. St. Thomas Aquinas was great at it. Didn't get anywhere because the context was wrong. So rationalization, rationalizing, rational thought, all of these things are secondary to something stronger. Looking for the lamppost for the lost keys. That's a version of Esau and the cup of soup, giving up something really important for convenience, like finding the keys. Linear scaling, well, hardly anything that's interesting is linear. And so we can't give in to our nervous system on looking at scaling. This has been really disastrous in programming, because programming is taught as though the programs don't turn into systems and the systems don't turn into something large, and as though there isn't an internet and so forth. This is getting completely mistaking simple chemistry for biology. They're just not in the same ballpark. So Francis Bacon, see, here's Thoreau again. One of the advantages of reading a lot is hardly any of us, certainly me, all my ideas are derivative. Just because I've read thousands of books. I didn't have to puzzle this out because Bacon wrote a book called the Novum Organum in 1620, where he said, hey, look, our brains are messed up. We have bad brains. He called the ways of messing up idols. So we get serious errors because of our genetics. We get serious errors because of the culture we're in. We get serious errors because of the languages we use. They don't represent what's actually out there. We get serious errors from the way academia hangs on to bad ideas and teaches them over again. These are his 4 idols. Anybody ever read Bacon? He said, we need something to get around our bad brains. A set of heuristics is the term we'd use today. And what he called for was what he called for science. because that's what Novum Organum, the rest of the title, was a new way of dealing with knowledge. And science is not the knowledge, right? Because the knowledge is in this context. What science is the negotiation between what's out there and what we can represent. This is the big idea. This is the idea that they don't teach in school. This is the idea we should be teaching. It's one of the biggest ideas of all time. It isn't the knowledge, it's the relationship, because what's out there is only knowable by phenomena that is being filtered in every possible way. And we don't know whether our brain is even capable of representing the stuff. And so to think about science as the truth is completely wrong. It's not the right way to look at it. But if you think about it as a negotiation between the best you can do right now and stuff that's out there where you're not completely sure, you're in a very strong position. Science has been the most powerful thought system human beings have ever invented because it gave up the idea of truth. And it substituted for it 1,000 variations of false, some of which are incredibly powerful. Right? This is the big idea. So if we're going to think about computing, this is one way. Now, Seymour Papert thought about it in a different way, but this is one way of thinking about, wow, computers, they are representers. We can learn about representations. We can simulate ideas. We get a very good, much better sense of dealing with thinking about these complexities. Okay, so maybe one last part of this pep talk, and then I'll turn it over to Vishal. So let's go back to the pink plane here. And let's say we're at a place on the pink plane and we have a goal. So we're at A. We only are looking in that direction because that's where we're going. We see B. We say, let's plot a course to B. But guess what? The world is nonlinear. So we're really in that because we didn't think about all the dimensions. Okay. So we can explore. We can tinker away around it. That's better. If that was good, we can engineer a superhighway. And if we're really adventurous, we can invent the airplane. Forget about land travel. Let's just fly over that mountain. And here's the big idea. Once we decide to take off from land travel, we not only are in a different world, we discover we're in a blue world, and the blue world has a much better destination than B. So I submit this as a metaphor that can be used in many different areas. Like, simple one, often you have to go away from your goal to get to your goal. That is a toughie. Remember, we're primates. The way they catch monkeys in Burma, everybody know this? Oh, everybody should know this. Okay. So monkeys are primates like us, and what they do is they just fasten jars, and they put a big nut. The monkeys reach in to get that nut. They can't get their hand out. Okay, now, that monkey could escape any time by just letting go of this nut. But guess what? They don't let go of the nut. Does that sound like any human activity you've ever heard? They can't let go of the nut. So in the morning, they just come around, and so they're like monkey brains in Burma. So they come around, just collect these monkeys that could get away anytime they wanted. If that isn't us, I don't know what it is. So being able to go away from the goal, this is the heart, like NSF has completely blown it in computing because they've given up on problem finding and doing stuff that really doesn't have a goal in the proposal, for example. The goal should be to find the goal. Somebody needs to pay for that. The engineering as a refinement of something that's more like tinkling or bricolage, Seymour used to call it. And then this idea that, hey, maybe surface travel isn't the deal at all. Let's do something qualitatively different and start flying. And once you've made that effort to qualitatively change, suddenly you have the possibility of escaping from this whole context, which was actually holding you back. Okay, I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much for listening.